son, Tommy, is 6, and he is a boy with big feelings. Anyone else have kids or someone else in their lives who has big feelings? Seeing some nods and hands. Yeah. Tom is tremendously loving towards those closest to him. He is beyond generous and kind to those in his inner circle. But when he gets upset, wow. He's not destructive or outwardly intense, but he clearly holds these feelings very close and very deep inside of him. I didn't know a little body could hold such big things. His latest manifestation of this is to quietly tell me that he hates me when I've done something he doesn't like. After a few times of me telling him how hurtful those words are and can be, my response has now become, well, I love you, so there we are. Parenting young ones with big feelings is quite the job. Of course, what's underneath Tommy's feelings is usually hurt, right? These types of exchanges usually happen after he didn't get his way or he didn't feel understood. And as we spoke about last week with the temptations in the wilderness, we all hold a similar fear. It's a frequent fear that we won't be seen or honored or taken care of or loved. This is a lonely feeling. It's a raw feeling. And for my 6-year-old, it comes out as a quiet, I hate you. As we continue our journey of Lent and our Lenten theme of looking at the nature of fear in the scriptures, we come to this story of Abram and God. So it's important to have a little bit of historical context to this, and that's going to really function in a bigger way in my sermon this morning than it sometimes does. Abraham had already lived a full life by the time this story had taken place. A few chapters prior, he was 75 years old, and a good bit of his life story had unfolded since then. So he's had quite a journey. He and his wife Sarai were not young. Sarai is already described as having been barren. So it's important to keep in mind that this is a part of their story. It's a part of their journey. There's loss there. It's a loss that many of us know or have someone close in our lives who knows. Expectation of bearing children and then having that not happen, despite a desire to, is a very real, raw feeling. In this story, we see for the 3rd time in the scriptures that God appears before Abram and tells him that he would have numerous descendants. So, okay, 75 years plus, barren, no children, but numerous descendants. As the old saying goes, one of these things is not quite like the other. So when God comes to him a 3rd time, Abram lets some, in my mind, very understandable emotions slip. You have given me no offspring. And so a slave born in my house is to be my heir, as was common custom in that time. And a few verses later, God, how am I to know that I'm going to possess this land for my descendants? So there's a very real conversation happening here between parental figure God and Abram. But the text tells us also that Abram nevertheless believes God somehow. This is a man with big feelings. He believes and he trusts in God. Big feelings, big faith. But also, he is afraid and essentially points this out to God. How can I know that this is true? How many times have you experienced something like this? Not the 75-year-old hope of childbirth part, I hope, but the part where you really, really want to believe that something is true, but you can't quite get there. You really want to believe that something is true, but you can't quite get there. We can hope for something for so long that after a while, when it doesn't come, fear sets in. Is it really true? How can I know for sure? The promise that a lover loves us back. The promise that this kind of cancer shouldn't ever return. the promise that the promotion is just around the corner. These might be things we hope for, but always with a little dose of fear. What if they don't work out? How can we really believe in the midst of our fear? These are big feelings. They're deep feelings, and they're a challenge to untangle. It is here in this passage, though, after Abram speaks his piece, that God does something very strange, such that if you don't have historical context into this story, it really doesn't make any sense at all. And when listening, our eyes and ears can kind of glaze over. So I'm going to apologize in advance, but we really are going to get into the weeds here for a minute. Fear not. I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. But okay, after Abram asked his fear-laden question, how do I know this is true? How can my descendants be this numerous when I do not have any children? God tells him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Okay, so Abram does, and then without God having to tell him, Abram prepares them in a certain way. He cuts them in two, laying each half over against the other, all except for the birds, which he keeps whole. I'm sure you all would know exactly how to do the same thing. Okay, so as it happens, the prevailing code of conduct back in Abram's day was not any sort of legal entity. They didn't have police or well-established laws of the land or contracts, right? But there was something called a covenant. Theologian and writer Rob Bell writes this: in the ancient world, when you entered into a deal with someone, you made a covenant with them. It was an oath to do your part. First, you would get some animals, like a cow or a ram or a goat or a dove. Second, you'd chop them in half, all except for the birds you'd leave whole. And then you would lay out the halves with space in between them, forming an aisle. You would stand side by side at one end of the aisle made of the animal halves, and you would each state what you were going to do to uphold your end of the bargain. Finally, you would then walk between the halves of the animal while you said something like this: may I become like these animals if I fail to uphold my end of the covenant. In earlier cultures, yeah, this sounds like fun, right? Aren't you glad we got an aisle, we could make this happen. Anyway, okay, in earlier cultures where systems of justice and enforcement were more primitive, and in some cases non-existent, your word was your bond. Rituals like these were like glue. The bond, the insurance, the way that people trusted each other, the way that society held together. May I become like these animals if I fail to uphold my end of the covenant. By the way, this is where the phrase cut a deal comes from. Cutting something in half, which the English major in me finds pretty cool. But anyway, all this is to say that this procurement and division of animals would have been a common, well-known practice, though it was usually one animal or the other or the other. God says, bring them all. But Abram knows what to do. Two people are about to make promises to each other. Did it always quell the fear at the time? Probably not. But your word was your bond. And in a time when behavior was tribal, and sometimes there were sides to be picked, it really mattered to have neighbors you could trust. So when covenants were made, it behooved them to keep it. So Abram knew what he was doing. He prepared the animals. But it is here where the story takes a very unusual turn, if this wasn't unusual enough for you. For while it's common for two people to make a covenant like this, it was not at all common for God to deign to do so with a human. In a time when gods ruled without much regard for humans, this would have been a really, really surprising story. But still, Abram prepares the animals, probably thinking they're going to cut a deal. Okay, I'm making a deal with God. This is pretty unusual. This is shocking, actually, but I have an idea of where this is headed. The sun goes down, and a terrifying darkness encircles God and Abram and the animals. Terrifying darkness. How often does fear come at nighttime. But then God says, know this for certain, even in the midst of the darkness, and he proceeds to give Abram the slightest peek at Abram's future and Abram's future offspring's fate, which eventually has them returning to the promised land. This is the first glimpse we get this, all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. Then, and this is the amazing part, that doesn't make a lot of sense unless you untangle all this stuff, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch go between the animal pieces. And the story says that God made a covenant with Abram that day, a covenant that would eventually unfold in the stories of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt and Moses and let my people go and Abram's descendants and all the other ites that Teresa read, and eventually to Jesus and beyond. So this is the beginning of that story. And it's a bit of a wild story with animals being sacrificed and all of these strange happenings. But here's the part that is astounding to me. And it goes back to our Lenten discussion of fear. What passed between those two carcass pieces? What passed in that aisle? The fire pot and the blazing torch. Symbols of God. What didn't go that way? Abram. This is upside down. Covenants are rooted in one person doing this and the other person doing that, right? This is an equal exchange. This is money being spent. These are arrangements being made, promises being made by two parties. It is meant to be an equal exchange with the words, may I become like these animals if I fail to keep my end of the covenant. But in this story, Abram doesn't do anything. Abram doesn't promise a single thing. To earn God's love and promises, he just stands there. Fear not, says God. I am who I am. And I'm going to do this for you. All of it. So, quick recap. God promises Abram that he'll have a huge number of offspring, again, for the third time. Abram, older and childless, says, what are you talking about? And God swears an oath, not just a promise, but a covenant in which God says, no matter what you do or don't do, or whatever you might feel, Abram, I got you covered. I will do it all. I am who I am, and I will do this. And this is the difference between promises made to one another, which can be broken, and promises from God, which cannot. God cannot break God's promises to us. Believe it or not, there are some things that God, who can do anything, actually cannot do. And it is always rooted in that God cannot go against God's very nature. God always keeps God's promises and goes the extra mile, both sides of the aisle, so that those promises and covenants are upheld. My 6-year-old is a deeply loving soul, right? But he'll still quietly say, I hate you, when that fear and that anger and that disappointment become too overwhelming for him. And my response continues to be, well, I love you, so there we are. Or at least I try. Sometimes my little one's big feelings become a bit much for me. I will admit I am a person with big feelings too. And aren't we all? But this is never impossible for God. I love you, so there we are. You don't need to hold up any part of this covenant. I love you, so there we are. Even to the point of dying on the cross. The love of God knows no bounds, and certainly is not conditional upon our response. God is never-endingly faithful, even when we are not, even when our big feelings or our fear get in the way. So, beloved of God, when you find yourself afraid that the promises are too good to be true, afraid that there is no goodness on the other side of whatever you're living with right now or holding right now. Many of us walk tough journeys. When you are afraid that things are just not going to work out, when you are afraid that normalcy is a thing that happened in 2019, but we will never see the likes of that again, these are okay feelings. God provides space for that fear. Ample space. God never condemns Abram for Abram's feelings of, really, God, you're telling me this a third time? God says, There is space for that fear because in that space is also a way forward that God gives. It is a way forward made by our God, the light that shines through the pieces of our dead and empty promises lying on the ground. It shines with compassion on where we are and covenants to love us no matter what. In this season, as we encounter fear, may we remember our never-ending belovedness in the eyes of our God, the source of that deep love. God just loves us and will always hold up both ends of that bargain. That's where we are. Thanks be to God. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.